In case you haven't noticed, asking for help while working in technology can be really difficult, whether because of social implications or personal expectations. It's really hard to reach out and ask for help solving a problem or for answers to our questions when we need them the most. But it's important to recognize that there are few skills as crucial to being an effective engineer as doing this, right? Because if we can't leverage one another, then how are we ever supposed to get things done on time and to a sufficient level of quality? All of the technology that we use to go about our lives every day was made by the collaboration of engineers and others before us. And so if we can't do that, it's really hard to do just about anything else, at least in my experience. I mean, there's always those 10x programmers who can just kind of figure everything out themselves and implement it all really quickly without bugs really fast. But I'm not one of those mythical people quite yet. And so we need to do this if we're going to grow over the course of our engineering careers and ultimately become the kinds of people that others go to with their questions or with hands outstretched asking for help solving what they're working on. And so I wanted to discuss two things. Firstly, how we can get over this kind of all-encompassing fear at times of asking for help. And then secondly, once we've done that and we actually are going to go about asking for help, how we can do that as effectively as possible. Because at the end of the day, it should be clear to both us and to the person helping us that the time we spent working together trying to solve this problem worked, and that something's going to get done that wasn't getting done previously because we sat down and had this conversation. And that kind of buyer's guarantee for the person helping you is what will make them be more willing to come back and help you over and over and over again and develop kind of a mentor relationship. And similarly, when you're in that seat and you're helping someone else, you want to know that the work you're doing to help them isn't a waste of time. Otherwise, you should have just been doing your own stuff, right? So we really want to make sure that we're asking for help effectively in order to get things done, which leads me to my first kind of tip about getting over our fear of asking questions, asking for help. We should reframe asking for help from a personal weakness or show of vulnerability to a personal strength in service of the solutions we're developing or the problems we're solving. Because at the end of the day, if we're trying to get something done and there's a challenge that is preventing us from doing it, going out and asking for help is in service of overcoming that and getting our work done. I realize that people send me things to ship. People ask for features or to run experiments and tests and whatnot. People ask me to do these things, and I get these things done. And at times, I need help from others. And my ability to go ask for that help is part of what allows me to get my job done effectively. So asking for help, asking questions, essentially is a feature, not a bug, right? It's something that we need to do. And so when we think about reaching out to others, we can't fixate on, am I going to look weak? Am I going to look stupid? Am I going to look like I can't do incapable of doing the work that I was hired to do? Instead of focusing on that, focus on, is this going to allow me to do the work that I'm paid to do, that I'm hired to do? And getting that work done is a show of strength and a show of capability, right? So it's all in service of the same goal. So we should reframe asking for questions or asking for help or asking for answers to questions as a feature of getting our work done, not a bug that gets in the way. That's number one. Number two, and I want to talk about general tips, but also machine learning in particular. And I think that these next two are very specific to machine learning as well. Number one, the devil is often in the details. And effectively, when I'm talking about details, I'm talking about implementation, right? And if, just because you understand something at a conceptual level doesn't mean that you're expected to know every single possible implementation of it or every single pitfall that you might commonly face. It doesn't mean 100% code coverage. It just means competency. And so, in general, if you put on your resume or you advertise to the people you work with that I understand the concept, I understand what a neural network is, super basic things about neural networks, like what is backprop, right? You should probably know what backprop is if you know about neural networks and how to train them. But if you're then implementing backprop from scratch, or using like highly performant backprop or backprop for a specific use case or model type, and something's not what you're used to seeing, or you're getting an error message that you haven't encountered before, like all those more idiosyncratic things, it's unrealistic to expect that to be within the scope of putting neural networks on your resume or telling someone that you understand neural networks. Just because you understand a concept doesn't mean you understand every single thing about getting it done. If that were true, high school physics would be enough to send rockets into space, right? We'd be able to ignore air resistance like we do in all those stupid high school problems. That doesn't make any sense, right? Things get more complicated. Things get more idiosyncratic. And when we encounter thorns that we haven't seen before, that's okay. And not expecting to do that is super unrealistic. I'm not entirely familiar with LeetCode, but from what I've heard from people who are more familiar with it, I think this is part of the complaints that people have, because just because you understand like what a hash map is, going to someone and being like, bam, like implement a hash map right now from scratch, or implement smart pointers right now from scratch, is a big ask, right? Or use hash maps or smart pointers or whatever the hell else we're talking about. I'm just going to pull stuff out of the air to do a very specific thing right now with no Google or AI assistance or anything, right? That can be at times unrealistic, because once we're on the job, those things are okay. What's important is that we get the job done, right? And asking others for help, which is ultimately what we're talking about. I'm not just talking about Googling things all day, is part of the job. So that's number one. Number two, in regard to like more ML specific tips, but again, applies in general, is that if the work you're doing is novel enough, which I've been really grateful that a lot of the work I've been doing is kind of research oriented, so running tests and experiments and collecting results, like lots of questions haven't actually been answered yet. Or if they have been answered, that answer is not widely accessible yet, right? So if you go out and you're looking for information on really cutting edge technologies and it's not out there yet, there's a non-zero probability that it's just not out there yet. And that's okay, right? As a counterexample, like FFTs are incredibly old, right? And I'm just using this as an example because I've been working kind of adjacent to FFTs recently. Working with FFT, one more time, FFTs are pretty old. And so lots of things with, the common like libGSL library, the math behind FFTs, different ways FFTs can be used. Like FFTs have been around for a very long time. I think the original paper was like 1965 or something. And so it's unrealistic to expect there to be as much information about mixture of expert models for LLMs as there is about FFTs. That's just unrealistic. The FFTs have way more runway for people to accrue information. And the few times that I go to search for novel ML stuff and I find answers to the very specific things I'm working on, it's usually been in white papers. And usually those don't have the most implementation info, right? They kind of just write it up once, like test it, get the results, and dump it out in the ether and trash everything else, unfortunately. And this is why, like, one of the things I like about where I work is that they're very diligent about documenting stuff and recording everything so that it's reproducible, right? But anyway, that's an aside. So the important things here are reframing asking for help as like a personal strength, a part of our job that's kind of somewhat detached from our value and our proficiency as an engineer. Or if you're going to attach it to yourself, try to attach it in a positive light, right? That's number one. Number two, just because we understand something conceptually, it's unrealistic to expect us to not have any questions about working with it ever. And number three, if you go out and look for answers to novel or extremely specific questions, there's a good chance it just doesn't exist yet. And that's okay, right? So that last point does serve as a good segue to part two of this, which is going to be, how do we ask for help as effectively as possible? Now, while I just discussed, you may go online and you may look for things and not find what you're looking for, and that's pretty common. to be honest with you, right? If you've worked in software engineering before, you know that's pretty common. Stack Overflow is only so useful. Same goes for ChatGPT, even the premium models, right? But it's still important that we try. It's still important that we go out there and look online, look at open source documentation, look at internal documentation if it exists for internal tools that we're using or company specific ways that we're using open source stuff. It's important that we go out there and try to find it, if for no other reason than to make us more confident going into asking for help, or make us more knowledgeable about the thing we're asking for help with, or adjacent questions to the question we're asking, right? One point in here that isn't immediately obvious, especially if you're working, like I find that when I'm doing code on my own, I'm much more willing to do this than at the job, and I've kind of been trying to break this down, so I'm more willing to do it while I'm working. But like filing bug reports is super productive in my experience, even if you never hear a peep back from contributors, right? Because you have to reproduce the error. So now you have like effectively a test bench that you can use to tweak what you're working on and try different things, right? You have to look at the error messages. You have to document what you're trying to do, what's getting in your way. You have to put it all together in a neat, readable format and send it out into the world, right? And so going through this process of filing a bug report can be really helpful, even if it's never answered. Now, I've found that if you're kind of signaling demand to these contributors, usually they will at least give you a verbal answer, like a written answer, even if they don't, go and merge the whole PR that fixes every complaint you ever had with the tool. They at least hear you and they'll respond to you. At least that's been my experience working on some mid to large scale open source tools, right? So bug reports are great and underrated, especially when we're at work. That's number one. Number two, probably the second most important thing to do when you ask for help is articulate what you need as clearly as possible, right? Because it's hard enough for someone trying to help you to solve exactly what you're asking them to solve, but that gets like exponentially harder when they don't know what that thing is. So it's really important that you articulate either the problem you're trying to solve, the blocker you're trying to get through, or the question that you need to answer as clearly and succinctly as possible for the other person's sake. And then the biggest thing in my experience, which if you ask me when I say I've developed a skill around asking for help, what's the biggest part of that skill? It's knowing who to ask. Like flat out. Asking the right person, even more important than articulating the question properly in my experience, is the most important question. And there's lots of things to factor into it, right? Number one, who's most likely to be able to answer your question? But following that, who's most likely to have the bandwidth to answer your question? Hopefully this doesn't vary a lot depending on your work culture, who's the most likely to be willing to help you? Even if they have the bandwidth, if they're not willing to help you, then it might not be worth asking them. And then lastly, who's invested in either your success or the success of your project, right? Now, oftentimes that's just a function of our job titles, like our responsibilities at work. So if you're working on a tool and you have a boss with more years of experience than you working on tools or similar, on this tool or similar ones, they're a great person to ask versus someone who works in a whole different group in your lab or on a whole different product. Doesn't make any sense, right? So picking who you ask is, in my experience, like the most important part of asking for help. Is in general as an engineer, and especially in ML engineering when things can get kind of niche, right? And then lastly, I wrote some notes about like good ways to make the ask, which some of these are kind of common sense. Like I wrote like pick the right time. Duh. I'm gonna skip most of this. What I won't skip is I think the most important part is write shit down. Like, write everything down for two reasons. The first reason is if you sit down and have a long conversation with somebody, like for an hour, when we sit down for a college lecture, those college lectures are usually 40 minutes or like an hour 15 or something, right? And everyone's expected to take notes so that they remember stuff going forward. But all of a sudden, when we get out into the workforce, we just forget how to sit down and take notes from someone as they're speaking to us, right? Take notes, because you're going to need these things later. You're going to forget what people said, or you're going to misinterpret what people said. Or if you ask multiple people, you're going to want to compare things against one another. Write everything down. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most important part of making the ask correctly. I also have here as a final addendum, you're not entitled to help from someone. So at the end of the day, like if you make the calculation wrong and someone doesn't have the answer to your question, which, that just kind of eliminates them from answering it, right? If they don't have the answer. But if they don't have the bandwidth or just aren't willing, be polite, move on, maybe regroup and try to ask someone else. Just recognize that you're not entitled to others' help, even if they're like listed as your mentor. They have their own shit to do, right? So don't take liberties. It's my main point with that final addendum. But in conclusion, to get better at asking for help as engineers in competitive fields like machine learning, we need to get over our fear of doing it, and we need to make sure that each time we do it, it's effective towards working on our goals, like working on our solutions that we're trying to come up with. To overcome our fear, we should reframe asking questions, recognize that expecting implementation level omniscience is just unrealistic, even if you understand a concept in general. And then recognize that lots of the problems that we're working on, if it's cool stuff, which ideally everyone who's engaging with this kind of content is getting to work on cool stuff, so good things, the answer might not be out there yet. And then lastly, to ask for help effectively, cover your bases, like look for things online, articulate what you need clearly, go to the right person and write everything down. By the end of it, fold up your notepad and walk out with a smile and say thank you. And then hopefully by the time that we've done all this stuff, we have answers to our questions. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. I make videos about being more effective engineers in software and aerospace in AI ML. Because I've been working in these fields for a little while now, and it can be kind of daunting. And so I figured I'd share my experience with others. Hopefully you all engage with the content, you get something out of it. And yeah, we can all grow together towards becoming better at our jobs. So yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.